Night settled over Manor Farm with a kind of weary heaviness that seemed woven into its very soil. The farmhouse windows glimmered faintly as though ashamed of the warmth within, while the outbuildings crouched in darkness like tired beasts awaiting another dawn of labor. The animals knew this stillness well. It was the pause between one day's burden and the next, a moment when even the wind hesitated above the fields. Yet tonight there was an unusual quiver in the air, a whisper that something long dormant had begun to stir. Old Major had summoned them. That alone was enough to trouble their sleep. The boar, now ancient and softened only in body, not in mind, had requested their presence in the barn after Mr. Jones had retired. Such a thing had not happened in living memory, and the animals, though weary, felt the pull of something larger than themselves. One by one they crept from their stalls, hooves muffled on straw, wings folded tight to hide any tremor, and gathered beneath the rafters where dust motes drifted like pale ghosts. The barn smelled of old hay and the faint bitterness of spilt milk. Lantern light from a crack in the farmhouse door caught the dust in thin, wavering bands, giving the place an eerie shimmer. Horses stood at the front, their massive shapes casting long shadows. Clover, broad-flanked and gentle-eyed, glanced frequently at the entrance as though expecting Jones to stumble in at any moment. Boxer, steadfast and solid as the barn itself, stood beside her with a patience that seemed carved from oak. The sheep clustered near the middle, muttering softly among themselves. The hens perched on a rail, heads tilting in short, jittery movements. Even the dogs, usually aloof, lay close together, ears pricked and alert. When old Major at last rose upon his straw bed, a hush fell so complete it might have smothered the very air. His hide had lost its sheen, and his tusks grew yellow and blunt, yet there remained in his eyes a steady fire that commanded respect. The animals leaned forward instinctively, as though drawn by the gravity of his presence. "My friends," he began, his voice hoarse yet carrying, "my time among you grows short. But before I go, there is something I must share, something that has troubled my thoughts through many sleepless nights." A faint shudder passed through the barn. It was not fear exactly, but the thrill of hearing truth spoken aloud after too long a silence. Old Major's words slid into the dimness like the first warm breeze of spring, stirring what lay buried in each heart. He spoke of the farm, of the toil that bent their backs and the hunger that clawed their bellies, of a world where animals labored endlessly while humans reaped the fruit of their misery. They all knew these things, of course, they lived them daily. But hearing them drawn together, named plainly, felt like the sudden lifting of a veil. Even the youngest animals strained to catch every word. They had seen little of life beyond the farmyard, yet they understood the weight behind the old boar's voice. A sense of collective memory seemed to awaken, a recognition of the whip's crack, the cold trough in winter, the silent acceptance forced upon them by years of routine. Major's speech swelled, filling the barn like a rising tide. "The life of an animal," he declared, "is misery and slavery. Yet it does not have to be so. Our labor is the very engine of this farm, but its profit is not ours. Remove man, and the root of our suffering is removed forever." The animals shifted uneasily. The word man hung in the air like smoke, foul, suffocating, impossible to ignore. Even those who barely understood the complexities of the world grasped the essence. Jones was the cause of their hunger, their exhaustion, their fear. Then old Major spoke of a dream. At the mention of it, the animals leaned closer still, as though the barn itself leaned with them. It was a dream of a world free from human tyranny, a world where fields ripened for those who plowed them, where food was shared by all, where no hoof trod on another. There was a crystalline simplicity in his tone, a conviction that made the impossible feel within reach. He began to sing. The song was old, older than any of them, older perhaps than the farm itself. Its melody unfurled like a banner across the gloom, and the animals felt something inside them loosen, lift, and brighten. They joined him hesitantly at first, then with growing fervor, until the barn trembled with the swelling chorus of "Beasts of England." The tune was rough, imperfect, but carried a raw hope that seemed to echo deep in their bones. When the last notes faded, silence returned, but it was transformed, no longer oppressive but charged like the skies before a storm. Old Major sank back into the straw, exhausted, yet satisfied. The animals remained where they were, unable to move or speak for some time. Something had shifted among them, subtly but undeniably. The dream still clung to the rafters like mist. Then somewhere outside a door slammed. The animals froze. Jones's heavy steps echoed across the yard, accompanied by the sharp scent of beer. A lantern beam flickered briefly through the barn wall. But the steps soon drifted away again, swallowed by the night. When at last the animals slunk back to their stalls, they carried with them more than the memory of the song. They carried a new, unsettling awareness, of injustice acknowledged, of hope awakened, of change whispering at the threshold of their lives. And though none yet understood the full consequence of Old Major's words, the farm itself felt altered. The air seemed taut, as though something long suppressed had begun to breathe. By dawn, nothing visible had changed. The sun rose on the same weary buildings, the same misty fields, the same yoke of labor. Yet beneath that familiar surface, a spark glowed quietly in the hearts of the animals. It was small, fragile, perhaps destined to gutter out, or perhaps to ignite into something far greater than any of them could imagine. The morning after Old Major's death dawned thin and gray, the kind of morning that pressed its chill upon the farm as though urging the animals to a quiet obedience. Yet beneath that quiet drifted a subdued hum of expectancy. The pigs, who had spent the night in hushed conferences, emerged with a solemn gravity, as though burdened by some sacred duty they had not sought but could not refuse. Snowball's eyes shone with a fervor bordering on impatience, while Napoleon moved with measured steps, his silence carefully cultivated, giving the impression of depth rather than withholding. The other animals gathered near the barn, where traces of the old boar's presence still lingered, as if the straw itself remembered his trembling voice. Clover nudged Boxer gently, sensing his unease despite his massive frame. Boxer shifted his hooves with the clumsy politeness of a creature whose strength outstripped his comprehension, but even he felt a stirring that he could not name. It was as though a veil had lifted from the routines of their lives, revealing a possibility that had always been there, unspoken. The pigs presented themselves not as leaders, but as interpreters of Old Major's dream, a dream they claimed was too grand, too intricate for the simpler animals to grasp without guidance. Snowball spoke first, describing with a trembling urgency the details of a world without man, the warm abundance of harvests untainted by greed, the freedom to rest when tired, the dignity of labor honored rather than exploited. His words were like sparks striking dry tinder. Murmurs rose among the animals, a low but growing swell that rippled through the barnyard. Yet for every burst of hope, there was a shadow of doubt. Muriel the goat, ever cautious, squinted toward the farmhouse windows where Mr. Jones still slept off a night's drink, unaware that his name had become the anvil upon which a revolution was being hammered. Even Moses, the raven, watched with a shrewd, sidelong eye, as if weighing whether a change of master would alter the prospects of his sugar candy tales. And through it all, Napoleon's gaze moved slowly from animal to animal, assessing, calculating, absorbing every flicker of emotion with an unsettling calm. The first real crack in the farm's familiar order came not with a shout or a blow, but with a shortage of feed. Jones, drifting deeper into his habitual stupor, had failed once again to tend to the animals properly. Empty troughs and unmilked cows stood as silent indictments of his negligence. Hunger gnawed at the animals with a sharper bite than idealism ever could. What had begun as a murmur of ideas thickened into a restless dissatisfaction that swelled with each passing hour. It was in that restless atmosphere that Napoleon and Snowball began quietly preparing. They spoke to the animals in small clusters, weaving Old Major's vision into something more immediate, something tethered to the very ache in their bellies. Even Squealer, with his quick tongue and unblinking enthusiasm, worked tirelessly to stitch unity into the gathering discontent. He presented the pigs' intentions as pure necessity, as though they alone could translate revolution into reality. Jones's own behavior added fuel to the smoldering resentment. His bursts of drunken temper, once feared, now seemed pitiful and weak. When he tripped over a bucket and cursed at a cow that had done nothing but stand in his path, a ripple of indignation passed through the animals. It was not yet rebellion, but the air trembled with its possibility. The animals began watching Jones differently, not with dread but with a faint, dangerous contempt. Evenings grew tense. The pigs held more meetings. Whispers threaded through the barn like a draft. The commandments Snowball had drafted were discussed in cautious tones, as though speaking them too loudly might invite some unseen punishment. But in truth, the old fear was already losing its grip. Something was shifting, slowly, inexorably. And so the stage was set long before the first shout or the first charge. The farm, with all its decay and quiet suffering, seemed to wait. The animals waited with it, hungry, restless, and balanced on the edge of change. They did not yet know what they were preparing for, nor how irrevocably their world would soon be remade. But the wind that brushed across the fields carried a new scent, not of hope alone, but of the first tremors of upheaval. The rebellion, when it finally burst upon Manor Farm, came not with the thunderclap of a grand uprising but with the ragged desperation of starving creatures who had been pushed one indignity too far. For days the animals had endured empty troughs and unrelieved labor, while Jones and his men stumbled through the farmyard in a haze of drink and irritation. The cows' udders ached from neglect. The hens pecked at the hard earth hoping for stray grains, and Boxer, though steadfast, felt a heaviness in his limbs that no amount of will could shake. Hunger sharpened every sound, every smell, every tremor in the air, until the animals' patience stretched thin as old rope. It was on a particularly bleak morning that Jones, having spent the night in town, returned only long enough to collapse on his kitchen chair and bark a slurred order that no one carried out. The animals waited, as they always had, for the familiar rattle of buckets or the sound of grain being poured. But nothing came. The minutes crawled by. By midday the strain became unbearable. The cattle lowed plaintively, the sheep shuffled in agitation, and even the ever-cautious Benjamin twitched his ears in silent warning. When at last the animals could endure no more, it was not Snowball or Napoleon who acted first, but the horses, Boxer and Clover, nudging open the door to the store shed in a quiet, almost apologetic act of necessity. The moment the hinges creaked, a surge of bodies followed, driven less by rebellion than by raw, instinctive hunger. Mouths plunged into sacks. Hooves scattered grain. A wild, chaotic frenzy erupted, but it was a frenzy born of life grappling with its own survival. Jones awoke to the uproar, his face mottled with anger and confusion. He seized his whip and stormed toward the shed, shouting threats that once would have driven the animals back in trembling retreat. But today the whip cracked not against submissive backs, but into a wall of desperation that had hardened into resolve. The sting of leather against hide ignited something that had smoldered for months. Snowball let out a sharp, ringing cry, half command, half warning, and suddenly the animals surged forward as one. It was not a battle in any noble or orderly sense. It was a torrent. The dogs, startled by the sudden tumult, barked uselessly before scattering. The cows charged with lowered horns. The horses reared, their great hooves striking the earth like drums of war. Even the timid ducks and geese flapped and pecked in frantic solidarity. Jones swung his whip wildly, but the tide had already turned against him. A sheep collided with his legs, sending him sprawling. The men, roused by his shouts, grabbed whatever tools were at hand, but fear flickered across their faces as they confronted a farmyard united in fury. Snowball pressed forward at the front, fearless, exultant, almost incandescent with conviction. Napoleon remained slightly behind, his movements controlled, calculating, taking stock of the power revealed in the animal's charge. But whatever their motives, the pigs were swept along in the unstoppable force that now drove Jones and his men backward, toward the gate and out onto the road. One last kick from a hoof, one last flurry of feathers, and the humans fled, stumbling over each other in their haste. The gate clanged shut behind them with a finality that echoed across the fields. And then silence. It was a strange, trembling silence, as if the air itself held its breath. The animals stood in the yard, each one dazed by the enormity of what had happened. Boxer stared at his hooves with a troubled expression, as though unable to believe they had been instruments of violence. Clover pressed her muzzle to his shoulder, offering silent reassurance. The sheep bleated uncertainly. Even Snowball's triumphant glow dimmed for a moment as he surveyed the scene, as though trying to grasp the full weight of their sudden freedom. It was Squealer who recovered first, bursting into excited chatter about victory and destiny, weaving phrases that soothed the animals' unease and stoked their growing pride. Gradually, the stunned stillness gave way to murmurs, then cheers, then a rising chorus of exhilaration. Together they swept through the farm, confirming that every building, every field, every trough now belonged to them. The farmhouse loomed like a monument of the old tyranny, its windows glinting coldly, but even that sight could not dim their sense of triumph. Snowball proposed that they explore the house, carefully, respectfully, without disturbing anything unnecessarily. They entered with hushed awe, treading across carpets that seemed too soft, too foreign for their hooves. The luxury inside struck them with the force of revelation. The softness of the feather bed, the gleam of silverware, the shelves of books no one had ever imagined contained worlds beyond their own toil. To the animals, it felt like trespassing into a realm that had always been forbidden, and Clover gently urged the ducklings away from a glass cabinet as if afraid that the mere brush of a wing might undo their victory. When they emerged again into the sunlight, the farm felt changed, not in appearance but in essence. The yard, the fields, the barns all seemed to breathe differently. They belonged to the animals now. Truly belonged. The sense of possibility was almost dizzying. That night, beneath a sky unmarred by the presence of any human light, Snowball led the animals in singing Beasts of England with a fervor deeper than any before. Their voices rose into the darkness, trembling with exhaustion, pride, and a hope so raw it bordered on fear. For the rebellion had not simply given them freedom, it had torn them from everything familiar. They stood at the edge of a future they had longed for but did not yet understand. And though joy filled their hearts, a faint, imperceptible unease flickered beneath it, like a candle guttering in a draught. In the weeks that followed the rebellion, Animal Farm simmered with an energy that was part triumph, part bewilderment, and part something else, something quieter and harder to name. The animals worked with an enthusiasm that bordered on feverish, driven by the conviction that each stroke of the hoe, each forkful of hay, was a blow struck for their own dignity. Never had the fields been tilled with such earnest vigor, nor had the harvest been anticipated with such unity of purpose. Yet beneath that unity ran thin, wavering filaments of unease, as if the very earth felt the tremor of changes not yet fully understood. Snowball threw himself into the work with tireless intensity. His mind leapt constantly from one scheme to another: committees for cleaner barns, classes for reading and writing, slogans to strengthen morale. His idealism spread like a warm blaze among the animals, warming especially those who hungered not just in the belly but in the soul. Even the hens attempted to learn their letters, pecking earnestly at chalk marks on broken pieces of slate. Napoleon, however, observed it all with an inscrutable calm. He offered approval sparingly and criticism more often, yet always in a tone that made his judgments sound not like opinions but like facts uncovered through some deep instinct. He disapproved of Snowball's committees, declaring that the young needed discipline, not indulgence, but he never argued loudly. His strength lay in silence, in the subtle nudge of influence, the quiet word in the stable during feeding time, the lingering presence that made animals straighten their backs when he passed. Squealer, ever alert, became Napoleon's indispensable voice. When the pigs announced that they would henceforth take all the milk and windfall apples for themselves, murmurs rose among the animals, faint, uncertain, but unmistakable. Squealer's speech, delivered with frantic earnestness, played upon their fears with uncanny precision. He painted man not as a defeated foe but as a lurking menace who might return at any moment, and he warned that without the pigs' brainwork, the fragile freedom they had won could collapse in an instant. "Do you want Jones back?" he squealed, and the question struck the animals with a force that silenced every doubt. It was a turning point, small, almost invisible, but decisive. The animals returned to their tasks with bowed heads, troubled yet willing to believe what they had been told. It was easier, after all, to trust the pigs than to confront the fragile uncertainty of self-governance. Boxer, whose faith was both his strength and his vulnerability, adopted a new maxim: Napoleon is always right. He muttered it softly as he hauled stones for the foundation of the windmill, though the windmill existed only in Snowball's feverish plans and Napoleon's simmering disdain. The pigs had begun sleeping in the farmhouse by then. At first the animals noticed only small things: a candle burning in an upper window late at night, the faint murmur of voices behind the curtains, or the smell of cooking drifting from the kitchen. When Clover timidly questioned whether this was proper, Muriel read the commandment aloud, and indeed, it said only that no animal should sleep in a bed with sheets. The pigs had removed the sheets, Squealer explained, so there was no violation. And once again the animals nodded slowly, pushing down the faint flutter of unease. Autumn deepened into cold. The work grew harsher, the nights longer, and the enthusiasm that had once carried the animals through their labors began to fray. Snowball's plans for the windmill filled the barn walls with diagrams and calculations no one else understood. He envisioned a world in which electricity would ease their burdens. Warm stalls, running water, mechanical tools that would lighten the load of every creature on the farm. His passion made the animals feel a glow of possibility, but it also stirred something sharp and envious in Napoleon, whose eyes narrowed whenever Snowball addressed a crowd. Their rivalry grew slowly, like a storm building on a distant horizon. At meetings, Snowball dazzled with his eloquence, while Napoleon countered with simple phrases that appealed to instinct rather than reason. The animals found themselves torn. Snowball stirred them to dreams, Napoleon grounded them in fears. Bit by bit, those fears began to win. When Snowball revealed his completed plans for the windmill, the animals burst into applause. Napoleon stepped forward, sniffed the drawings as if they were a rotting carcass, and urinated on them without a word. Gasps filled the barn. Yet Napoleon did not argue, did not explain. He simply turned and walked away. The quiet contempt of that gesture lodged deep within the animals like a thorn. The farm stood at a crossroads then, though the animals did not see it clearly. Their unity, once a blazing force, had dimmed into something more fragile, still warm but flickering. They trusted the pigs because they could not imagine doing otherwise. They worked because work was the only language they had ever known. The dream of a better future hovered just out of reach, like a lantern seen through fog. And though the rebellion had given them freedom, the shape of that freedom was already shifting, curling into new shadows cast by those who had learned how to wield authority. By the time another year had turned on Animal Farm, the sharp thrill of rebellion had faded into a distant, almost mythic memory. The fields, once symbols of promise, now bore the weary imprint of endless labor, and the animals trudged across them with a resignation that had seeped deep into their bones. The windmill, rebuilt after its first ruin, stood crooked against the gray sky, its cracked stones a monument less to triumph than to exhaustion. Yet the pigs spoke of it with such fervor that the animals could no longer distinguish success from mere survival. Boxer's death had struck the farm like a silent blow. His absence lingered in the yard like a cold draft, whispering of betrayal none dared articulate. Squealer's explanation, that Boxer had been sent to a veterinary hospital, had been accepted reluctantly, numbly, as though the animals feared their own doubts more than his smooth lies. But Clover, who knew the lines of the old horse's face better than her own reflection, could not forget the lettering on the side of the van, or the panic in Boxer's eyes as it carried him away. Even Benjamin, who had never invested hope in anything, seemed worn down by the knowledge that the world had proved him right once more. Still, the pigs continued to speak of sacrifice. They praised Boxer as a martyr of the windmill, a hero whose strength had paved the way for Animal Farm's glorious future. "Forward," they cried at every assembly. "Forward for Boxer." The words echoed like brittle glass on stone, hollow and sharp. The farm changed in ways that were subtle enough to escape immediate notice, yet profound enough to remake its very nature. The pigs, now walking on hind legs with an ease that astonished even themselves, wore clothes taken from Jones's old trunks. Squealer strode about in a waistcoat far too small for his swelling body, puffing with pride as he recited new statistics about production that bore no resemblance to the truth. Napoleon carried a whip. The crack of it, soft but unmistakable, sliced through the farm's silence like a reminder of a world the rebellion had sworn to end. The commandments, once painted in bold, hopeful letters on the barn wall, had become a palimpsest of revisions. Where there had been purity, now there was obfuscation. Where there had been clarity, now there were clauses and modifications that justified whatever the pigs wished to do. The final version, "All animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others," was read aloud so often that it lost the sting of absurdity and instead settled into a weary, accepted truth. Snowball's memory had been recast entirely. He was no longer the brave spark in the rebellion's first fire, but a sinister traitor whose alleged misdeeds expanded with each telling. The animals felt uneasy whenever his name was spoken, yet the unease was not for Snowball himself, but for the faint, stubborn recollection that the truth had once been different. Memory, however, had become a dangerous burden. Better to accept than to question. Better to forget than to fear. Trade with neighboring farms increased. Humans visited more often, walking through the yard with smirking curiosity. The pigs greeted them warmly, clinking glasses, bargaining for timber and grain as though the rebellion's founding proclamation had been nothing more than a childish whim. The other animals watched uneasily from a distance, sensing in the humans' confident strides and Napoleon's ingratiating smiles a collapse they could not fully name. One evening the animals crowded around the farmhouse windows, drawn by the glow of lamplight and the sound of laughter, human laughter, pig laughter, mingling into one indistinguishable chorus. Inside, the pigs sat with the neighboring farmers, drinking toasts and playing cards. Napoleon, now broad and heavy with indulgence, raised his glass and declared that the name Animal Farm would be abolished. They were returning to the old name, Manor Farm. It was a moment that cleaved through the animals' hearts with a dull, crushing weight. Everything they had bled for had been undone with a single sentence. As the animals peered inside, their faces pressed against the glass, a strange unease settled over them. The pigs had changed so thoroughly, voices roughened, gestures sharpened, faces altered by indulgence, that the animals found themselves unable to tell them apart from the men they sat beside. When a dispute erupted over a game of cards, Napoleon and Mr. Pilkington shouted accusations of cheating, their fists thudding against the table in identical rhythms. For a moment the room blurred. Then, in the lamplight's trembling glow, the animals saw clearly. There was no longer any difference, no boundary, no betrayal left to reveal. Man had returned, not in form but in spirit. And the rebellion, once a blazing promise cast into the future, had collapsed into a closed circle. Outside, the wind rustled across the dark fields, carrying with it the faintest trace of the song they had once sung with such hope. But none of the animals dared raise their voices now. They stood silently, pressed together for warmth, staring through the window as the laughter swelled. The world they had dreamed of had slipped through their hooves, replaced by one indistinguishable from the tyranny they had overthrown. The glass reflected their faces faintly, tired, worn, bewildered. Behind the glass, the faces of pigs and men blurred into one. And the animals, who had once believed themselves the authors of a new dawn, understood at last that the night had never truly lifted.